The annual Rose Society competition at Bramblewood Manor had become, over the course of 32 years, less about horticulture and more about the delicate art of maintaining one's position in the intricate social hierarchy of St. Mary Mead. On this particular Saturday afternoon in late June, the Georgian Manor's gardens bloomed with more than prize-winning roses. They fairly hummed with the kind of polite tensions that made English village life both charming and treacherous in equal measure. Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne, the Manor's imposing mistress and 15-time consecutive winner of the competition, moved through her guests with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to command. At 62, she remained a formidable figure, her silver hair immaculately styled, and her navy dress perfectly pressed despite the afternoon's warmth. Yet those who knew her well might have noticed a certain tightness around her pale blue eyes, a barely perceptible tremor in her usually steady hands as she adjusted the placement of prize cards on the judging table. The competition had drawn its usual collection of hopeful participants and devoted spectators. Young Timothy Ashford, barely 30 and still considered something of an outsider despite 3 years' residence in the village, tended to his innovative climbing rose hybrid with nervous attention. His wife Sarah stood beside him, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. Their first child was expected in autumn, and the village ladies had been particularly solicitous throughout the afternoon. Timothy's roses had caused quite a stir the previous year by placing second, a feat that had not gone unnoticed by Mrs. Blackthorne. Dr. Marcus Webb, the village physician who had taken early retirement at 58, examined his deep purple specimens with an intensity that seemed almost medical in its precision. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the afternoon light as he made minute adjustments to his display, and more than one observer had whispered that his roses might actually challenge Mrs. Blackthorne's supremacy this year. The doctor himself appeared uncomfortable with such speculation, frequently glancing toward the manor house with an expression that suggested his mind was occupied with matters beyond horticulture. Mrs. Vivian Holloway, the handsome widow who ran the village post office, stood beside her pale pink David Austin roses with characteristic determination. At 55, she maintained her dignity admirably despite the financial strains that had become increasingly apparent since her husband's death 2 years prior. Her entry fees had been paid, as always, though several villagers had quietly noted the careful mending in her summer dress, and the way she declined offers of refreshment with polite but firm resolve. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself strategically on a wrought-iron bench near the herbaceous borders, her knitting needles clicking with soft, rhythmic precision as she worked on a pale yellow cardigan. To the casual observer, she appeared absorbed in her lacework, but her mild blue eyes missed nothing, not Mrs. Blackthorne's increasingly frequent trips to the small potting shed tucked discreetly behind a screen of honeysuckle, not Dr. Webb's nervous adjustment of his spectacles whenever the hostess passed near his display, not the way young Mrs. Ashford's face tightened with something that might have been anxiety whenever her husband spoke with other competitors. The judging was to be conducted by Professor Edmund Hartwell, the renowned botanist from Cambridge, whose weekend cottage just outside the village had made him a reluctant but prestigious addition to local society. His expertise was unquestioned, though his manner could be rather brusque when dealing with amateur gardeners who failed to meet his exacting standards. This year, however, even the professor seemed affected by an unusual tension that had settled over the proceedings like morning mist. As the afternoon progressed toward the climactic moment of judgment, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. Professor Hartwell made his rounds with deliberate care, examining each entry through his magnifying glass and making cryptic notations in his leather-bound notebook. The guests clustered around the refreshment tables, their conversations punctuated by glances toward the rose displays and the small group of competitors who hovered near their entries like anxious parents at a school performance. It was precisely at 4:30 when Mrs. Blackthorne excused herself from a conversation with the vicar's wife, claiming she needed to fetch additional scorecards from the potting shed. Miss Marple, who had been observing the hostess's mounting agitation throughout the afternoon, noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Blackthorn's voice and the way her fingers worried at the pearl brooch on her lapel. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Professor Hartwell, consulting his pocket watch with evident impatience, announced that he was prepared to declare the winners. Several guests began to murmur about Mrs. Blackthorn's absence, and Dr. Webb volunteered to check on their hostess's whereabouts. It was young Timothy Ashford who found her first, drawn by his wife's sudden gasp as she peered around the honeysuckle screen. Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorn lay crumpled beneath the climbing roses that formed a natural canopy over the potting shed entrance, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her face already taking on the waxy pallor that spoke of something far more final than a simple fainting spell. Scattered around her still form were the crimson petals of her prize-winning Bramblewood Beauty roses, as if the flowers themselves had come to pay their respects to their fallen mistress. The small brown bottle clutched in her right hand told its own story, though Miss Marple noticed with interest that its label had been carefully removed. As screams shattered the genteel tranquility of the afternoon, and Dr. Webb rushed forward to examine the body. Miss Marple remained quietly on her bench, her knitting needles continuing their steady rhythm while her observant eyes catalogued how each person in the garden reacted to this unexpected tragedy. The annual Rose Society competition had reached its conclusion, though not in any manner its participants had anticipated. Death, it seemed, had claimed the ultimate prize. The discovery sent a ripple of shock through the assembled guests that quickly crystallized into the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected death in a small community. Dr. Webb, his medical training overriding social convention, knelt beside Mrs. Blackthorn's still form and performed the grim ritual of confirmation. His fingers found no pulse at her neck, and after a careful examination that avoided disturbing the scene, he rose with the gravity befitting his pronouncement. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed garden. "Very recently, I should think. The circumstances—" He gestured toward the small brown bottle, its label conspicuously absent. "Well, they suggest this was not natural." Sarah Ashford swayed against her husband's supporting arm, her pregnancy making the shock particularly difficult to bear. Timothy guided her to a nearby garden chair, his face pale but determined as he positioned himself protectively between her and the tragic scene. The young man's hands, which had been so confident among his prize roses moments before, now trembled slightly as he smoothed his wife's hair. Professor Hartwell approached with the methodical precision he typically reserved for botanical specimens, though his scholarly composure showed signs of strain. "The police must be summoned immediately," he declared, adjusting his spectacles as he surveyed the area without touching anything. His notebook remained clutched in his left hand, forgotten in the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Holloway stood frozen beside her pale pink roses, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal genuine distress beneath. "Poor dear Cordelia," she whispered, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. She seemed perfectly well earlier, though perhaps a bit anxious about the judging. The arrival of Inspector Craddock within the quarter hour brought official authority to the scene. A competent man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a methodical approach, he quickly took charge of the situation, directing the guests away from the immediate area, while Dr. Webb provided his preliminary assessment. "Appears to be poisoning," the doctor reported with professional detachment. "That bottle contained something, though someone has removed the label. Given the location and Mrs. Blackthorn's recent behavior, suicide," Inspector Craddock concluded, making notes in his official pad. It was a logical assumption under the circumstances, and one that the assembled villagers seemed eager to embrace. The alternative was far more disturbing to contemplate. The whispered conversations that followed carried the theory through the group like ripples across a pond. "The pressure of the competition," Mrs. Clement murmured to her neighbor. 32 years of winning, and this year with such strong entries. Others nodded knowingly, remembering Mrs. Blackthorn's increasingly frequent trips to the potting shed during the afternoon, her obvious agitation as the judging approached. Miss Marple, still seated on her wrought iron bench with her knitting, observed these developments with the mild interest of someone accustomed to tragedy in small places. Her gentle blue eyes missed nothing. Not the way Timothy's gaze kept returning to the potting shed, not Mrs. Holloway's nervous adjustment of her carefully mended gloves, not Professor Hartwell's scholarly fascination with the crime scene despite his obvious distress. Most interesting to Miss Marple was Dr. Webb's careful positioning of himself between the body and the other guests, as if his medical authority extended naturally to crime scene preservation. She also noted, with the eye of someone who had observed human nature for many decades, that Mrs. Blackthorn's left glove remained perfectly in place, while her right hand, which clutched the fatal bottle, was bare. For a woman as particular about appearances as Cordelia Blackthorn, such a symmetry suggested urgency rather than deliberation. As Inspector Craddock began organizing preliminary interviews, Miss Marple rose quietly from her bench and drifted toward the refreshment table with the aimless quality of an elderly lady seeking distraction. Her route took her past the wasp trap hanging from a low branch, a jam jar with freshly knotted string, recently replaced by the look of it. Beside the refreshment table sat a stack of clean tumblers and, oddly separated from the rest, one glass turned upside down as if to dry, leaving a faint opalescent ring on the white tablecloth beneath. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the rose arbors, casting long shadows across what had begun as a genteel competition and had become something far more complex. As the police began their methodical work and the villagers were shepherded toward the gate with promises of formal statements to follow, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and reflected that in her considerable experience, the most obvious explanation was rarely the complete truth. The annual Rose Society competition had indeed reached its conclusion, though the final judgment would prove far more complicated than any botanical assessment Professor Hartwell might have rendered. The discovery sent a ripple of shock through the assembled guests that quickly crystallized into the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected death in a small community. Dr. Webb, his medical training, overriding social convention, knelt beside Mrs. Blackthorn's still form and performed the grim ritual of confirmation. His fingers found no pulse at her neck, and after a careful examination that avoided disturbing the scene, he rose with the gravity befitting his pronouncement. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed garden. "Very recently, I should think. The circumstances suggest this was not natural." Inspector Craddock's arrival within the quarter hour brought official authority to the scene. A competent man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a methodical approach, he quickly took charge, directing the guests away from the immediate area, while Dr. Webb provided his preliminary assessment. The inspector's initial conclusion seemed logical under the circumstances. Suicide, driven perhaps by the pressure of competition and the fear of losing her long-held supremacy. Yet as Craddock began his preliminary interviews with those who remained, details emerged that painted a more complex picture. Professor Hartwell, adjusting his spectacles nervously, revealed that Mrs. Blackthorn had asked him to examine Timothy Ashford's hybrid roses closely, implying some impropriety in their provenance. "She seemed decided about something when I last saw her," the professor admitted reluctantly, "though I must say her bramblewood beauty had developed a minute flaw in the petal margins this year. She would not have won." This revelation hung in the air like morning mist, suggesting that Mrs. Blackthorn's distress might have had deeper roots than mere competitive anxiety. Timothy Ashford's face flushed at the accusation of impropriety, his protective stance beside his pregnant wife speaking to wounded honor rather than guilt. It was Sarah Ashford who provided the most intriguing piece of information, her voice small but certain as she recalled the afternoon's events. "I saw her give something to someone just before the judging. A small envelope passed through the trellis near the honeysuckle." I couldn't see who it was. Just a man's sleeve, dark-colored. I thought it was some society business. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the herbaceous borders, noted with interest how this revelation affected the remaining suspects. Dr. Webb's hand moved unconsciously to adjust his spectacles. Professor Hartwell's dark blazer suddenly seemed more significant, and even Timothy's lighter tweeds took on new meaning in the context of Sarah's observation. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her pregnancy making the day's shocks particularly difficult to bear. "The lemonade at the refreshment table tasted odd, so I switched glasses with Timothy when he wasn't looking. It had a strange smell, like marzipan in a hot cupboard. I thought it was just my condition making me sensitive to scents." Dr. Webb's face remained professionally impassive, but Miss Marple noticed the way his hands stilled, completely at this description. The scent of bitter almonds was not unfamiliar to those with medical knowledge, and the implications of Sarah's innocent confession cast the afternoon's events in an entirely different light. As Inspector Craddock organized the formal interviews and the remaining guests were finally dismissed, Miss Marple made her quiet way home, her mind turning over the day's revelations like pieces of a complex puzzle. The evening brought with it the particular atmosphere that settles over a village after sudden death, a mixture of subdued excitement and genuine sorrow that manifested in hushed conversations at garden gates and lingering glances toward the now sealed manor. The following morning found the village eager to embrace the comfortable narrative of suicide. At Holloway's post office, Mrs. Vivian Holloway moved about her duties with unusual efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the way her eyes kept returning to official-looking envelopes bearing the return address of Blackthorn Manor's solicitors. "Such a terrible shock," Mrs. Holloway murmured as she sorted the morning mail, though Cordelia had seemed rather strained lately. The competition meant everything to her, perhaps too much. Her fingers drummed nervously against the counter, leaving small smudges on the polished wood. Dr. Webb, encountered outside his surgery, showed clear signs of a restless night. His usually neat appearance was slightly disheveled, and he carried himself with the careful precision of someone fighting exhaustion. When Miss Marple gently mentioned the careful removal of the bottle's label, his reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by a too-quick recovery. "Depression can affect anyone," he said with forced medical authority. "Sometimes the pressure of maintaining appearances becomes unbearable." Yet something in his manner suggested he was convincing himself as much as her. The Ashford cottage revealed its own tensions, with Timothy pacing anxiously while Sarah rested heavily in her chair. Through the open window, Miss Marple caught fragments of worried conversation about drawing attention to themselves and the police asking questions, the kind of anxiety that suggested guilt about something, though whether connected to Mrs. Blackthorn's death remained unclear. As Miss Marple made her way home past the sealed gates of Bramblewood Manor, she reflected on the morning's encounters. Each person seemed eager to accept the suicide theory while simultaneously displaying behavior that suggested deeper anxieties. The postmistress worried about police investigations, the young couple spoke of avoiding attention, and the village doctor appeared almost desperate to medicalize Mrs. Blackthorn's death. Most telling was how quickly everyone had agreed on the explanation of suicide, building a collective case for Mrs. Blackthorn's supposed despair. Yet Miss Marple's considerable experience had taught her that when a community reaches consensus too readily, the truth often lies in an entirely different direction. The village might be content with its neat explanation, but the small inconsistencies, the missing glove, the switched lemonade, the mysterious envelope, suggested that the true story of Mrs. Blackthorn's death was far from complete. Like a patchwork quilt with one square that didn't quite fit the pattern, the accepted narrative covered the immediate shock, but left troubling loose threads that, in Miss Marple's experience, had a way of unraveling the entire design. The days following Mrs. Blackthorn's death brought with them the particular atmosphere that settles over a village after sudden tragedy. a mixture of genuine sorrow and barely suppressed curiosity that manifested in hushed conversations at garden gates and meaningful glances toward the sealed manor. Miss Marple, who understood the rhythms of such communal grief, allowed herself to be drawn naturally into the gentle current of village speculation while maintaining her own careful observations. Inspector Craddock's visit to her cottage on Wednesday morning proved most illuminating. The competent officer accepted tea with the air of a man seeking more than refreshment, and Miss Marple, recognizing his unspoken request for insight, shared her observations with the understated precision that had served her so well over the years. "One did notice certain inconsistencies," she mentioned gently, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. Mrs. Blackthorn's right glove was missing, yet the left remained perfectly fastened. Cordelia was not a woman to leave herself half-dressed, Inspector, and that curious film beneath the overturned glass at the refreshment table, as though something had clouded when mixed. Craddock's pencil made careful notations as she continued. The envelope young Mrs. Ashford observed being passed through the trellis suggests some form of communication that required discretion. Professor Hartwell wore a dark blazer, as did Dr. Webb. The location would have provided excellent concealment for such an exchange. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Clement's arrival, ostensibly to discuss parish matters, but clearly eager to contribute her own observations. The vicar's wife possessed that invaluable combination of good intentions and encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs that made her an excellent source of background intelligence. Cordelia had been receiving rather distressing correspondence lately, Mrs. Clement confided once the proprieties had been observed. Official letters that seemed to upset her considerably. Mrs. Holloway mentioned the frequency when I collected the parish mail, and there was the matter of Dr. Webb's regular visits. Not for illness, you understand, but for what he termed consultations. This intelligence cast the doctor's obvious distress in a new light. His early retirement, attributed to a desire for quieter pursuits, might have concealed more pressing concerns. Miss Marple filed this information alongside her growing collection of inconsistencies. The afternoon found her making a seemingly casual visit to Bramblewood Manor, where the police had concluded their preliminary examination. The gardener, Pritchard, proved unexpectedly forthcoming when approached with gentle appreciation for his horticultural expertise. Mrs. Blackthorn didn't hold with chemical pesticides, he explained, gesturing toward the wasp traps hanging strategically throughout the garden. We used traditional methods, beer and jam mostly, with a touch of laurel water when the insects proved stubborn. Dr. Webb had suggested the laurel infusion, said it was more effective than commercial preparations. Miss Marple's mild interest in this detail concealed her recognition of its significance. Laurel water, while traditional, contained compounds that could prove dangerous in concentrated form. The proximity of the traps to the refreshment area took on new meaning when considered alongside Sarah Ashford's description of the lemonade's peculiar scent. The trap nearest the refreshment table had been freshly restrung, Pritchard continued, unaware of the importance of his observation. Dr. Webb tied it himself yesterday morning, very particular about his knots, he is. A careful examination of the trellis where the envelope had been passed revealed a dark thread caught on the lattice. Wool of good quality, consistent with either Professor Hartwell's blazer or Dr. Webb's jacket. More intriguing was the small object she discovered near the base. A pearl-headed pin, its tip slightly discolored as though it had pierced something damp. The potting shed yielded its own secrets. Behind a terracotta pot, Miss Marple found Mrs. Blackthorn's missing right glove, its palm tacky with dried residue that carried the faint, sweet-bitter scent Sarah had noticed. The careful placement suggested someone had hidden it hastily, perhaps intending to dispose of it later, but forgetting in the confusion following the discovery of the body. Her final call of the day was on the Ashford cottage, where she found Timothy in a state of considerable agitation. The young man's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something approaching desperation, and when he spotted Miss Marple, he seemed to reach a decision that had been weighing on his mind. "There are things that should perhaps be said," he began hesitantly, glancing around to ensure privacy. "About my roses, I mean. They weren't entirely my own work, not in the way the competition intended. I'd been purchasing specimens from a grower in Kent and adapting them. Mrs. Blackthorne had discovered this somehow." The confession explained much about the previous day's tensions. Timothy produced the envelope Sarah had seen pass through the trellis, a formal disqualification notice prepared in Mrs. Blackthorne's distinctive handwriting. Most interesting to Miss Marple was a small notation in the margin. MW 415, written in different ink, clearly added after the main text. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations while her knitting needles worked their familiar pattern. The village might prefer its simple explanation of suicide driven by competitive despair, but the accumulating evidence suggested a far more complex truth. The missing glove, the suspicious lemonade, the strategic placement of wasp traps containing dangerous compounds, and the mysterious marginalia all pointed toward deliberate deception rather than desperate self-destruction. Human nature, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, rarely offered simple solutions to complex problems. The true story of Mrs. Blackthorne's death was beginning to emerge from beneath the comfortable fiction of suicide, revealing something far more sinister than a moment of despair beneath the rose arbor. The preliminary inquest convened the following morning in the parish hall, where Inspector Craddock presented his findings with the methodical precision that marked his professional approach. The toxicology results had confirmed traces of hydrogen cyanide in Mrs. Blackthorne's system, though the small brown bottle clutched in her hand contained only water, a detail that effectively eliminated suicide as a possibility. Dr. Webb, called upon for his medical expertise, explained the symptoms and progression of cyanide poisoning with clinical detachment, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. His knowledge seemed remarkably comprehensive for a retired general practitioner, extending to detection methods and delivery systems that went well beyond routine medical training. Professor Hartwell's testimony proved particularly illuminating when he described his movements around the honeysuckle trellis at precisely 4 o'clock. Under gentle questioning, he admitted that Mrs. Blackthorne had specifically requested his examination of Timothy Ashford's hybrid roses, suggesting irregularities in their provenance that would warrant disqualification. When Timothy himself was called to testify, the young man's obvious distress became the focus of intense scrutiny. His admission that he had been near the potting shed around the time of Mrs. Blackthorne's death, ostensibly to retrieve presentation notes, provided both opportunity and proximity. More damaging still was his reluctant confession about the disqualification notice, a document that provided compelling motive for desperate action. "I thought if it appeared to be suicide, the matter might be forgotten," Timothy explained, his voice barely audible above the hall's collective intake of breath. "My wife's condition, the shame it would bring to our name, I simply wanted to protect her from further distress." Inspector Craddock's expression hardened as the pieces fell into place. A young man, with everything to lose, caught in deception, present at the scene with both motive and opportunity, it formed a narrative that satisfied the requirements of justice while offering the village a comprehensible explanation for tragedy. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her inconspicuous position in the second row, noted several details that troubled her methodical mind. The marginalia on Timothy's disqualification notice, MW 415, had been added in different ink, suggesting a later addition by someone other than Mrs. Blackthorne. The timing corresponded precisely with the victim's final trip to the potting shed, implying a prearranged meeting that Timothy claimed no knowledge of. Following the inquest, Inspector Craddock's search of the potting shed yielded the missing right glove, hidden behind a terracotta pot with the hasty carelessness of someone interrupted in their deception. The palm bore a tacky residue that carried the same sweet-bitter scent Sarah Ashford had noticed in the lemonade, confirming that the poison had been administered through direct contact rather than ingestion. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Mrs. Holloway's post office provided additional context that cast the case in a different light entirely. The postmistress, increasingly strained by the investigation's scrutiny, revealed that Mrs. Blackthorne had been receiving significant correspondence from London solicitors and banking institutions in recent weeks. She seemed to be making arrangements, Mrs. Holloway confided, her usual composure cracking under the weight of her observations. Asked about forwarding services, discretion in handling her mail. She appeared to be planning some sort of departure from St. Mary Mead, though she never said so directly. This intelligence suggested a woman preparing for change rather than one driven to despair by competitive pressure. More intriguing was Mrs. Holloway's admission that Dr. Webb had shown unusual interest in Mrs. Blackthorne's correspondence, claiming medical concern while asking specifically about financial documents. The doctor himself, encountered outside the village pharmacy, displayed the unmistakable signs of a man under considerable strain. His usually neat appearance had deteriorated. His hands showed a persistent tremor, and his explanations about Mrs. Blackthorne's anxiety and insomnia seemed rehearsed rather than genuinely observed. The competition pressure was quite severe, he insisted, adjusting his spectacles with unnecessary frequency. I'd been advising her about natural remedies for stress. The laurel water for the wasp traps was simply a traditional pest control method, nothing more. His defensive emphasis on the innocuous nature of the laurel water struck Miss Marple as particularly telling. In her experience, people rarely protested their innocence so vigorously when no direct accusation had been made. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village appeared satisfied with Inspector Craddock's focus on Timothy Ashford. The young man's motive was clear, his opportunity established, and his behavior sufficiently suspicious to warrant serious consideration. Yet Miss Marple, reflecting on the day's revelations while her knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm, remained profoundly unconvinced. The careful staging of the scene, the strategic placement of evidence, and the sophisticated knowledge required to administer contact poison all suggested someone far more experienced in deception than a desperate young gardener. The true killer, she suspected, remained hidden behind a facade of helpful cooperation, watching with satisfaction as suspicion focused elsewhere. The obvious solution, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, was rarely the correct one. Human nature, she had learned, preferred complex truths disguised as simple lies to simple truths that challenged comfortable assumptions. Timothy Ashford might serve as a convenient scapegoat, but the real murderer was still very much at large, concealed among those who appeared most eager to see justice swiftly served. The arrest of Timothy Ashford on Thursday morning brought a sense of resolution to St. Mary Mead that Miss Marple found deeply unsettling. While the village seemed eager to embrace this tidy conclusion, she remained troubled by the small inconsistencies that had been troubling her methodical mind since the afternoon of the competition. The MW 415 notation on Mrs. Blackthorne's disqualification letter continued to nag at her. It was far too precise and deliberate to be coincidental, suggesting a prearranged meeting that Timothy had never mentioned. Her morning visit to the Ashford cottage revealed Sarah in considerable distress, her pregnancy making the shock of her husband's arrest particularly difficult to bear. Yet it was the young woman's confusion rather than her grief that caught Miss Marple's attention most keenly. Timothy couldn't have done such a thing, Sarah insisted through her tears. He was with me when Mrs. Blackthorne went to the potting shed. We were discussing names for the baby, standing right by his rose display. Professor Hartwell was there too, examining the hybrid climbing roses. Timothy never left my side until we heard the commotion. This assertion, if accurate, would provide Timothy with an alibi that Inspector Craddock had apparently overlooked in his eagerness to close the case. Miss Marple made careful mental notes, recognizing the importance of verifying these details with Professor Hartwell, whose scholarly precision might prove invaluable in establishing the precise timeline of events. Her subsequent visit to Professor Hartwell's weekend cottage confirmed Sarah's account. though the academic seemed uncomfortable discussing the matter. His honesty eventually compelled him to admit receiving an envelope from Mrs. Blackthorne, though he characterized it as routine society business rather than anything more significant. "She asked me to deliver it discreetly to Dr. Webb," he explained reluctantly. "Said it contained her notes on laurel treatments she wished him to review. I placed it on the trellis ledge when I saw the doctor near the refreshment table, and when I returned moments later to deliver it properly, it had vanished." The timing he provided, approximately 4:10, corresponded precisely with the mysterious notation, suggesting that Mrs. Blackthorne had indeed arranged a meeting with Dr. Webb at 4:15. This revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light, pointing away from Timothy's desperate improvisation towards something far more calculated and premeditated. Miss Marple's afternoon exploration of the manor grounds yielded additional evidence that strengthened her growing suspicions. Near the trellis where the envelope had been placed, she discovered a small pearl-headed pin, its tip slightly discolored as though it had been dipped in something caustic. The careful placement suggested someone had dropped it hastily, perhaps intending to retrieve it later, but forgetting in the confusion following the discovery of the body. More revealing still was her examination of the rose identification cards. The card beside Mrs. Blackthorne's prize, Bramblewood Beauty, was conspicuously new, unmarked by the previous day's rain that had puckered the older cards. When she lifted it carefully with her handkerchief, a faint sticky film clouded the paper's underside, a ghostly sheen that caught the afternoon light like mother of pearl. "That's not varnish," old Pritchard observed, peering at the residue with professional interest. "We only varnish at season's start. Queer stuff, that." The implications were becoming increasingly clear. Mrs. Blackthorne, with her compulsive need for tidiness, would naturally have straightened any card that appeared askew. The poison had been applied to the identification card, knowing that she would handle it with her bare right hand before touching her pearl brooch, a nervous habit that everyone in the village had observed. A pinprick from a contaminated brooch pin would introduce the poison directly into her system, accounting for the rapid onset of symptoms and the missing right glove that had been used to handle the prepared surface. Her visit to Dr. Webb's surgery that evening confirmed her worst suspicions. The retired physician received her with strained courtesy, his hands showing a persistent tremor that worsened whenever the conversation touched on Mrs. Blackthorne's death. His study, usually meticulously organized, showed signs of recent disturbance, with botanical specimens and small bottles arranged with the hasty carelessness of someone under considerable stress. The poor woman was under considerable strain, he insisted, though his explanation felt rehearsed rather than genuinely observed. I'd been advising her about natural remedies for anxiety. The laurel. Water was simply a traditional preparation, nothing sinister in its application. Most telling was his reaction when Miss Marple mentioned the pearl-headed pin she had discovered near the trellis. Dr. Webb's face went quite pale, and his hand moved unconsciously to his lapel, where a similar pin typically secured his boutonniere. The absence of this customary ornament, combined with his obvious distress, suggested a connection he was desperate to conceal. "I find it curious, Doctor," Miss Marple observed gently, "that Mrs. Blackthorne, a woman of such meticulous habits, would have left her right hand bare and the glove so carelessly hidden, unless someone else had removed it after she had handled something unpleasant." As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The village might be satisfied with Timothy Ashford's arrest, but the accumulating evidence pointed toward a far more sophisticated deception. The careful staging of the scene, the strategic use of Mrs. Blackthorne's known habits, the medical knowledge required for the contact poison delivery, and Dr. Webb's increasingly suspicious behavior all combined to form a pattern that had nothing to do with desperate improvisation and everything to do with calculated murder. The real challenge would be proving what she now suspected, while an innocent man faced charges for a crime that bore all the hallmarks of medical precision disguised as amateur desperation. The truth as always in her experience, lay not in the obvious solution, but in the careful observation of human nature and the small details that revealed character more clearly than any dramatic confession. Miss Marple's determination to prove Timothy Ashford's innocence led her to pursue the one avenue that might provide concrete evidence of Dr. Webb's involvement, the financial arrangements that had given him both motive and opportunity. Her morning visit to the bank, conducted under the gentle pretext of parish concerns, yielded information that cast the entire case in a dramatically different light. Mr. Baines, the bank manager, proved unexpectedly forthcoming when approached with Miss Marple's characteristic blend of genuine concern and innocent curiosity. Mrs. Blackthorne, it emerged, had been the guarantor for a substantial annuity that supported Dr. Webb's early retirement, an arrangement that required her annual signature to remain in effect. More significantly, she had recently initiated inquiries about terminating this obligation, citing concerns about financial irregularities in her accounts that Dr. Webb had been managing. She seemed quite determined to sever all business connections with the doctor, Mr. Baines confided with careful discretion. The documentation for withdrawal had been prepared, requiring only her signature to take effect immediately after the Rose Society competition. Dr. Webb would have faced considerable financial hardship had she proceeded. This revelation provided the compelling motive that had been missing from the case against Timothy Ashford. Mrs. Blackthorne's death had not only prevented the termination of Dr. Webb's annuity, but had also silenced the only witness to whatever financial improprieties had prompted her decision to withdraw her support. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to Mrs. Holloway confirmed these suspicions while adding disturbing details about the victim's final weeks. The postmistress, her usual composure cracking under the weight of guilt and civic duty, revealed that Mrs. Blackthorne had been preparing for an immediate departure from St. Mary Mead following the competition. She had been making arrangements to liquidate substantial assets, Mrs. Holloway explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Asked about forwarding services for her correspondence, seemed quite determined to leave permanently. Dr. Webb had been pressing her repeatedly about these financial matters, claiming medical concern while showing particular interest in her banking documents. Professor Hartwell's afternoon visit provided the scientific corroboration that transformed suspicion into certainty. His botanical journal contained meticulous observations that confirmed the deliberate nature of Mrs. Blackthorne's poisoning, including precise timing notations that established Dr. Webb's presence near the contaminated rose card at the crucial moment. The identification card beside her Bramblewood Beauty had been replaced between my 3:30 and 4 o'clock examinations, he reported with scholarly precision. The original showed weather damage consistent with outdoor exposure, while the replacement appeared freshly prepared. Most significantly, I observed Dr. Webb adjusting something near that display at approximately 3:55. Armed with this evidence, Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock with a proposal that would force the true murderer to reveal himself through his own desperate attempts at concealment. The plan required careful orchestration of village gossip, that most reliable of rural communication systems, to create pressure that would compel Dr. Webb into incriminating action. If word were to spread, Miss Marple suggested gently, that the laboratory analysis had identified unique chemical compounds traceable to specific preparations, and that the pearl-headed pin had yielded fingerprint evidence, someone with genuine cause for concern might feel compelled to act. Craddock, recognizing the wisdom of this approach, arranged for strategic information to be released through Mrs. Clement and other reliable conduits of village intelligence. By evening, carefully constructed rumors about pending laboratory results and trace evidence had permeated St. Mary Mead's intricate network of communication. The trap was set with meticulous attention to detail. A decoy evidence box, prominently displayed in the manor's potting shed, contained harmless materials dusted with starch to simulate forensic testing. The constable's patrol schedule was adjusted to provide predictable gaps in surveillance, while Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock positioned themselves in the U-walk with clear sight lines to the crucial areas. The wait proved lengthy but ultimately rewarding. At 9:30, Dr. Webb emerged from the shadows near his surgery lane, moving with the careful efficiency of someone familiar with both the terrain and its surveillance patterns. His approach to the potting shed revealed intimate knowledge of the property's layout and security measures, knowledge that suggested previous reconnaissance or, more damning still, prior visits for similar purposes. His systematic search for the missing pearl-headed pin, conducted with the methodical precision of his medical training, provided clear evidence of his connection to the crime. More incriminating still was his careful manipulation of the rose identification cards, using a small vial to neutralize the opalescent residue that had been the murder weapon's telltale signature. When Inspector Craddock stepped forward to make the arrest, Dr. Webb's immediate surrender spoke to the overwhelming weight of evidence and his own exhaustion from maintaining an increasingly precarious deception. The inventory of his possessions, a pocket knife bearing chemical residue, wire tools for lock manipulation, and the neutralizing solution, provided the physical proof necessary to support the accumulated circumstantial evidence. As the doctor was led away through the moonlit garden where the crime had been committed, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of financial desperation, professional betrayal, and calculated murder that had masqueraded as a simple case of competitive suicide. The village might soon learn that their respected physician had been capable of the most heinous deception, but justice would finally be served for both Mrs. Blackthorne and the innocent young man who had nearly paid the ultimate price for another's crime. The rose competition that had begun as a celebration of horticultural achievement had revealed the darker aspects of human nature that Miss Marple knew lay beneath even the most civilized surfaces. Yet truth, as always in her experience, had ultimately prevailed through careful observation and the inexorable pressure of accumulated evidence. Dr. Webb's confession, delivered in the sterile confines of the police station the following morning, unfolded with the methodical precision that had characterized his approach to both healing and murder. Yet as Miss Marple listened from her inconspicuous chair beside Inspector Craddock's desk, certain details struck her as requiring further consideration, though she kept these observations to herself for the moment. Mrs. Blackthorne had entrusted me with her financial affairs for nearly 15 years, Webb began, his voice carrying the detached tone of someone recounting a medical case rather than confessing to murder. What began as legitimate investment management gradually became something far more complicated. The borrowing was never intended to become permanent, but circumstances conspired against repayment. Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning revealed the staggering scope of Webb's embezzlement. Over £30,000 diverted through falsified medical expenses and fraudulent investment documents that exploited his victim's trust and her somewhat detached approach to financial details. The discovery of these irregularities had prompted Mrs. Blackthorne's decision to terminate not only his annuity, but his access to her affairs entirely. The Rose Society competition provided perfect cover, Webb continued with clinical detachment. Cordelia's obsessive attention to detail, her nervous habit with the pearl brooch, her compulsive need to straighten anything askew, all could be exploited with surgical precision. His description of the murder's methodology revealed disturbing sophistication. The concentrated laurel preparation had required weeks of experimentation. The replacement identification card had been prepared with meticulous attention to Mrs. Blackthorne's known behaviors, and the timing had been calculated to exploit both her routines and the competition's natural distractions. Yet it was Webb's explanation of Mrs. Blackthorne's final envelope that provided the most chilling insight into his premeditation. She believed she was sending evidence of my financial irregularities to her London solicitor through Professor Hartwell, he explained. The notation MW415 was her reminder to confront me about the matter. She intended to offer me a chance to confess and make restitution, a misguided loyalty that proved fatal. Miss Marple noted with interest how Webb's account explained every piece of evidence while simultaneously revealing the victim's tragic misjudgment of his character. Mrs. Blackthorn's planned departure from St. Mary Mead had been prompted not by competitive anxiety, but by her discovery of systematic theft that threatened her financial security. The revelation of Timothy Ashford's complete innocence brought immediate relief to the young couple, though the shadow of having been suspected of murder would linger. Sarah's tears of gratitude when her husband was released spoke to the community's collective sense of having narrowly avoided a terrible miscarriage of justice. Mrs. Holloway's reaction to the news proved particularly revealing of the crime's broader implications. The postmistress, who had unknowingly facilitated Webb's monitoring of Mrs. Blackthorn's correspondence, displayed genuine distress at her inadvertent role in the deception. "He seemed so concerned about her welfare," she explained to Miss Marple during an afternoon visit, her usual composure showing signs of strain. "Always asking about her mail, particularly the financial, documents claiming medical worry about her stress levels. I thought I was helping protect her privacy." Professor Hartwell's scholarly analysis provided additional context that illuminated Webb's sophisticated approach. The botanist's examination of the concentrated laurel preparation revealed chemical knowledge that went well beyond amateur gardening, suggesting months of careful research and experimentation. As the immediate shock began to settle, the village grappled with the uncomfortable reality that their trusted physician had exploited their confidence in the most fundamental way possible. The man they had consulted for ailments, confided fears to, and relied upon for medical guidance had been systematically betraying that trust while maintaining a facade of professional competence. Yet Miss Marple, reflecting on the confession during her evening knitting, found herself troubled by certain inconsistencies that nagged at her methodical mind. Webb's account explained the major evidence admirably, but small details remained that didn't quite align with his narrative. The pearl-headed pin found near the trellis, for instance. Webb claimed it had fallen from his lapel during the crime, yet his boutonnieres typically used plain steel pins, a detail she had observed during his many years of village social functions. More puzzling still was the timing of certain events. Webb's confession placed him near the rose display at precisely the moment Sarah Ashford had observed the envelope exchange, yet Professor Hartwell had testified to seeing Webb near the refreshment table at that same time. While memory could certainly prove fallible under stress, the discrepancy suggested either confused recollection or deliberate misdirection. The financial audit that followed Webb's confession revealed the true scope of his betrayal, yet it also raised questions about Mrs. Blackthorn's recent behavior that didn't entirely align with Webb's explanation. Her correspondence with London solicitors had indeed concerned financial irregularities, but the timeline suggested she had been investigating these matters for several months, far longer than Webb's account implied. As the village began the difficult process of healing from such profound betrayal, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, recognizing that while justice appeared to have been served, the complete truth might prove more complex than even Webb's comprehensive confession suggested. The patterns of human nature, in her considerable experience, rarely offered solutions as neat as they initially appeared, and the small inconsistencies that troubled her methodical mind had a way of revealing deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of even the most convincing narratives. The rose competition that had provided cover for murder would be remembered not merely for its tragic conclusion, but as a reminder that the most dangerous deceptions often wore the most respectable faces, concealing years of systematic betrayal behind masks of professional competence and community concern. Miss Marple's unease with Dr. Webb's confession deepened considerably when Professor Hartwell arrived at her cottage the following morning, his botanical journal clutched with the precision of a man who lived by documented facts. The academic's discomfort was immediately apparent as he settled into a parlor chair, adjusting his spectacles with nervous frequency. "I fear there's been a rather significant oversight," Professor Hartwell began, consulting his meticulous notes with scholarly concern. "The timeline Dr. Webb provided simply cannot be accurate. At 3:55, when he claims to have been adjusting Mrs. Blackthorn's rose identification card, I observed him quite clearly at the refreshment table, engaged in conversation with Mrs. Clement about her arthritis treatment. I noted the time specifically because I was monitoring the judging schedule." This revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of a fundamental contradiction that threatened to unravel Webb's entire confession. Her examination of her own careful observations from that afternoon confirmed Professor Hartwell's account. She distinctly remembered seeing Webb near the refreshments when Sarah Ashford had witnessed the mysterious envelope exchange at the trellis. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm while her mind worked through the implications. "And the envelope that Mrs. Blackthorn asked you to deliver, you're quite certain of those details?" Professor Hartwell consulted his journal with academic precision. "Absolutely certain. I placed it on the trellis ledge at 4:10 when I saw Dr. Webb near the refreshment table, intending to deliver it properly when he moved closer. When I returned at 4:12, it had vanished. Someone else must have retrieved it during those 2 minutes." The significance of this timing became increasingly clear as Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's events. If Webb had been at the refreshments when the envelope disappeared, then someone else had been conducting business at the trellis. Someone who had allowed Webb to believe he was the intended recipient while pursuing their own agenda entirely. Her afternoon visit to examine the pearl-headed pin more carefully under proper lighting revealed additional evidence that had been overlooked in the rush to accept Webb's confession. The pin bore the distinctive hallmark of Harrods' exclusive jewelry department, along with a tiny manufacturing flaw, a minute dimple just beside the pearl's apex that would have been unique to a specific production batch from the early 1920s. More significantly, the pin's design was unmistakably feminine, featuring delicate engravings that no gentleman would have chosen for his lapel. Webb's boutonniere had always been secured with plain steel pins, a detail Miss Marple had observed during countless village social functions over the years. The implications led her naturally to Mrs. Holloway's post office, where she arrived with the gentle demeanor of someone seeking nothing more than stamps and casual conversation. The postmistress received her with strained courtesy, her usual efficiency showing signs of the stress that had been building since Webb's arrest. "Such a relief that the matter has been resolved," Mrs. Holloway said, though her hands trembled slightly as she sorted the morning mail. "Poor Dr. Webb, one never imagined such desperation could drive a respected man to such extremes." Miss Marple noticed immediately the small sewing basket tucked beneath the counter, its open lid revealing a neat array of pearl-headed pins pushed into an emery cushion. The pins' distinctive appearance matched exactly the evidence found near the trellis, complete with the same minute manufacturing flaw that marked them as part of an identical batch. "I've been wondering about that curious pin the police discovered," Miss Marple mentioned with mild interest, observing Mrs. Holloway's reaction carefully. Inspector Craddock seemed quite pleased to find it, though I confess I was surprised. Dr. Webb always struck me as preferring simpler fastenings for his boutonnieres. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Holloway's composure, already fragile, showed visible cracks as her gaze flickered involuntarily toward her sewing basket before darting away. Her fingers gripped the counter's edge with unnecessary force, leaving small indentations in the polished wood. "Pins are such common things," she replied, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "Anyone might drop one anywhere. The wind can carry such small objects considerable distances." The defensive tone and obvious distress revealed far more than Mrs. Holloway intended. Miss Marple's gentle probing had touched a nerve that went well beyond the shock of a neighbor's arrest. The postmistress was displaying the particular anxiety of someone whose own secrets were dangerously close to exposure. As Miss Marple made her way home through the afternoon shadows, she reflected on how the pieces were finally arranging themselves into a coherent pattern. Webb's confession, while comprehensive in its details, had been constructed around a fundamental deception. He had accepted responsibility for a crime he hadn't committed, either through misguided chivalry or his own desperate need to atone for different sins entirely. The true murderer had not only escaped justice, but had orchestrated the entire deception with remarkable sophistication. They had exploited Webb's obvious anxiety and financial difficulties to create a perfect scapegoat, while carefully positioning themselves as a helpful witness whose observations consistently directed attention away from the crucial evidence. Most chilling was the recognition that this person had been present throughout the investigation, offering assistance that appeared genuine, while systematically manipulating both the evidence and the investigators themselves. The pearl-headed pin, the strategic timing of revelations, the careful placement of contaminated materials, all bore the hallmarks of someone who understood not only the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of investigation. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared for what she now recognized would be the case's most dangerous phase. The true killer remained not only at large, but in a position of apparent respectability within the community, protected by the very confession that should have exposed them. The challenge would be proving what she now suspected, while ensuring that no further innocent lives were sacrificed to maintain this elaborate deception. Miss Marple's growing certainty about Mrs. Holloway's guilt required careful verification before she could approach Inspector Craddock with her suspicions. The discrepancies in Dr. Webb's confession, combined with the evidence of the pearl-headed pin, demanded a more systematic approach to uncovering the truth. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that guilt, when properly tested, would reveal itself through the smallest of reactions. Her morning visit to the post office provided the perfect opportunity for such an experiment. She arrived with the gentle demeanor of someone seeking nothing more than stamps and village news, though her mild blue eyes missed nothing as she observed Mrs. Holloway's increasingly strained efficiency. "Such a relief that the matter has been resolved with Dr. Webb," Miss Marple remarked casually, noting how the postmistress's hands trembled slightly as she sorted the morning mail. "Though I confess myself puzzled by certain small details that seem rather inconsistent with his account." Mrs. Holloway's response was carefully controlled, but Miss Marple detected the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of genuine anxiety. "One mustn't dwell on such unpleasant matters," she replied, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "The village has suffered enough shock." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while examining a small parcel with apparent interest. Indeed, though Inspector Craddock mentioned something rather curious about that pearl-headed pin they discovered. Apparently, Harrods keeps meticulous records of their jewelry sales, particularly items with distinctive manufacturing marks. Such attention to detail in these modern times. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Holloway's composure, already fragile, showed visible cracks as her gaze flickered involuntarily toward the small sewing basket tucked beneath her counter. The basket's open lid revealed a neat array of pearl-headed pins, their distinctive appearance matching exactly the evidence found near the trellis. "Pins are such common things," Mrs. Holloway said defensively, her fingers gripping the counter's edge with unnecessary force. "Anyone might drop one anywhere. The wind carries such small objects considerable distances." Miss Marple's gentle persistence revealed the deeper currents of deception that had been flowing beneath the village's placid surface. Her careful questioning about Mrs. Blackthorne's recent correspondence and financial arrangements elicited responses that confirmed her growing suspicions about systematic postal theft. Mrs. Blackthorne had been receiving rather significant correspondence from London solicitors, Miss Marple observed mildly. Such thorough investigations into financial irregularities. One wonders what prompted such careful scrutiny of her accounts after so many years of apparent stability. The postmistress's increasingly defensive responses revealed not only intimate knowledge of Mrs. Blackthorne's private affairs, but a desperate need to justify her access to information that should have remained confidential. Her explanations about postal procedures and customer confidentiality carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had been preparing such defenses for some time. Most damning was Mrs. Holloway's reaction when Miss Marple mentioned the mysterious 4:15 meeting notation found on Mrs. Blackthorn's papers. The specific time reference, known only to those involved in the victim's final arrangements, caused a visible pallor that no amount of composed explanation could disguise. The envelope that Professor Hartwell was asked to deliver, Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. It contained rather important documents, I understand. Bank statements and correspondence that would have been quite revealing to the proper authorities. Such a fortunate coincidence that it disappeared at precisely the moment when Dr. Webb was occupied elsewhere. Mrs. Holloway's careful facade began to crumble under this methodical pressure. Her attempts to redirect suspicion toward Dr. Webb's obvious guilt became increasingly frantic, revealing an intimate knowledge of his financial difficulties that went well beyond normal village gossip. The afternoon brought additional confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions when a discreet inquiry at the bank revealed patterns of financial irregularities that extended far beyond Dr. Webb's embezzlement. Postal money orders, bearing forged authorizations, redirected correspondence, and manipulated account statements painted a picture of systematic theft that had been conducted with remarkable sophistication over several years. Mrs. Holloway's position as postmistress had provided perfect cover for monitoring Mrs. Blackthorn's financial correspondence while systematically exploiting her trust. The widow's apparent financial hardship had concealed prosperity built on carefully orchestrated theft that exploited every aspect of her official position. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on how the pieces had finally arranged themselves into a coherent pattern. The pearl-headed pin, the timeline discrepancies, the sophisticated knowledge of poison delivery, and the systematic financial theft all pointed towards someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception while maintaining a facade of respectability. Most chilling was the recognition that Mrs. Holloway had not only committed murder to conceal her crimes, but had orchestrated Dr. Webb's false confession with remarkable psychological manipulation. The respected physician's guilt over his own embezzlement had made him an ideal scapegoat for someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. The true test of Miss Marple's theory would come in the careful confrontation that would force the killer to reveal herself through her own desperate attempts at concealment. The village might believe that justice had been served with Dr. Webb's arrest, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous criminal remained not only at large, but in a position of apparent respectability that made her virtually above suspicion. The time had come to arrange the final proof that would expose the truth behind Mrs. Blackthorn's death and free an innocent man from the consequences of another's elaborate deception. Miss Marple's plan to expose Mrs. Holloway required the delicate touch that had served her so well in previous investigations. Rather than dramatic confrontation, she chose the path of quiet, psychological pressure, allowing the killer's own anxieties to drive her toward revealing action. With Inspector Craddock's cooperation, she arranged for carefully selected information to filter through the village's reliable gossip network. The bait was elegantly simple. Word spread that Harrods had indeed traced the pearl-headed pin through their meticulous records to a specific customer, and that certain inconsistencies in Dr. Webb's timeline had prompted authorities to examine other possibilities. Most crucially, it was whispered that additional evidence had been discovered among Mrs. Blackthorn's papers that would necessitate reopening aspects of the investigation. Mrs. Holloway's reaction provided immediate confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions. The postmistress's usual efficiency deteriorated markedly as these rumors circulated, her hands showing a persistent tremor whenever she handled official correspondence. More tellingly, she began making inquiries about the investigation's progress with a frequency that went well beyond normal village curiosity. Such relief that justice has been served, she remarked to Mrs. Clement during the afternoon collection, though her voice carried an undertone of anxiety that hadn't been present before. One hopes there won't be unnecessary complications to distress the community further. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the post office provided the perfect opportunity to apply additional pressure. She arrived with the gentle demeanor of someone seeking nothing more than postal services, carrying an envelope addressed to Mrs. Blackthorne's London solicitors. Such a nuisance. Miss Marple sighed mildly as she requested registered delivery. The solicitors insist these duplicate documents be sent immediately. Something about tracing purchases from Harrods. Their record-keeping is quite remarkable, so I'm told. They can apparently track individual items through manufacturing marks and customer records going back decades. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Holloway's pen hesitated for the briefest moment before continuing, her neat script resuming with carefully controlled precision. The envelope, containing harmless parish correspondence but with a light dusting of fine powder inside the flap, went into the locked sorting drawer. That evening, positioned strategically in her cottage garden with clear sight lines to the post office, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Holloway's movements with the patience of someone accustomed to watching for revealing behavior. At precisely 9:30, when the village lay quiet under the lamplight, the side door of the post office opened and Mrs. Holloway slipped inside, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a familiar routine. The narrow beam of light that flitted across the interior revealed her systematic approach to examining the registered mail. When she lifted Miss Marple's envelope with careful fingers, the slight tremor in her hands spoke to mounting desperation. The steaming process she employed to open it without detection was conducted with the skill of long practice, though her usual composure showed signs of strain. Inspector Craddock's quiet arrest the following morning spared the village the spectacle of public confrontation while providing irrefutable evidence of postal tampering. The fine powder had recorded clear impressions of Mrs. Holloway's thumb and forefinger on the envelope's interior, while the steaming had left telltale moisture patterns that confirmed systematic mail interference. In the small interview room at the police station, Miss Marple's gentle voice provided the comprehensive explanation that tied together all the accumulated evidence. "You see, my dear," she began with characteristic understatement, "the difficulty lay in the small inconsistencies that others overlooked. The pearl-headed pin bore Harrod's distinctive hallmark and could be traced to a specific batch sold to your late husband's haberdashery. The sleeve observed at the trellis was dark, as yours often are, and your professional habit of wearing gloves when handling sensitive documents was mirrored by the missing glove at the scene." Mrs. Holloway's carefully maintained facade began to crumble as Miss Marple continued with inexorable logic. The identification card beside Mrs. Blackthorne's roses had been replaced between Professor Hartwell's examinations, clean and unworn, coated with concentrated laurel preparation that left the faint opalescent residue one could observe upon careful inspection. Mrs. Blackthorne's compulsive need to straighten anything askew made her the perfect victim for such a trap. The financial evidence proved equally damning. The systematic postal theft had extended far beyond Dr. Webb's embezzlement, encompassing forged money orders, redirected correspondence, and manipulated statements that exploited Mrs. Blackthorne's trust over several years. Most crucially, the victim's recent discovery of these irregularities had prompted her preparation to expose the theft through her London solicitors. Dr. Webb's obvious anxiety about his own embezzlement made him an ideal scapegoat, Miss Marple observed with quiet authority. His genuine guilt made him susceptible to accepting blame for crimes he hadn't committed, particularly when you suggested that confessing to a suicide might preserve his reputation while protecting his annuity. Mrs. Holloway's confession, when it finally came, revealed the full scope of her desperation and calculation. "She was going to destroy everything," she whispered, her composed mask finally slipping entirely. "After Harold's death, the postal position was all I had. The small amounts I took initially were just to manage. She had so much, was so careless with her affairs. But when she began investigating the discrepancies, the murder had been planned with meticulous attention to Mrs. Blackthorn's known habits and the competition's natural distractions. The concentrated laurel preparation had required weeks of experimentation, conducted under the guise of traditional pest control methods. The contaminated identification card had exploited the victim's compulsive tidiness, while the timing had been calculated to coincide with Dr. Webb's obvious distress about his own financial irregularities. As Mrs. Holloway was led away through the village streets where she had conducted respectable business for so many years, Miss Marple reflected on the complex deception that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent man. Dr. Webb's release brought justice for Mrs. Blackthorn while leaving the community to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that their most trusted citizens could harbor the darkest secrets. The village would heal as villages do, but with the sobering knowledge that appearances, however carefully maintained, could conceal years of systematic betrayal beneath their civilized surfaces. The rose competition that had provided cover for murder would be remembered not merely for its tragic conclusion, but as a reminder that human nature, like the most beautiful gardens, could nurture thorns alongside its blossoms. In her cottage that evening, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of justice properly served. The truth, as always in her considerable experience, had required patience and careful observation to emerge, but it had ultimately prevailed through the inexorable pressure of accumulated evidence and the killer's own desperate need to maintain control over an increasingly precarious deception. The days following Mrs. Holloway's arrest brought a peculiar quality to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were recovering from a fever that had distorted familiar faces and trusted relationships. The revelation that their efficient, widowed postmistress had orchestrated such calculated deception struck far deeper than Dr. Webb's financial improprieties, challenging the very foundations of community trust that had bound the village together for generations. Dr. Webb's release carried its own complexities, for while his innocence of murder had been established beyond doubt, his embezzlement remained a source of considerable shame. The village's reaction proved a study in the delicate balance between forgiveness and judgment that characterized small communities. His genuine remorse, evident in his voluntary confession to Inspector Craddock and his awkward but heartfelt apology to the Ashfords, gradually earned him a cautious sympathy from neighbors who recognized the distinction between financial desperation and cold-blooded murder. "I thought I could repay it all before she discovered the discrepancies," he explained during one of his visits to Miss Marple's cottage, his hands trembling as he accepted her offer of tea. When she began asking questions, I panicked and convinced myself that accepting blame for her death might preserve what remained of my reputation while protecting my annuity. Mrs. Holloway's manipulation of my guilt was masterful. The Ashford cottage had become a place of cautious celebration, though the shadow of suspicion would linger for some time. Sarah's pregnancy progressed well despite recent stresses, and Timothy's roses, cleared of any suggestion of impropriety, bloomed with renewed vigor. When Miss Marple arrived one afternoon with a small package containing delicately knitted booties, Sarah's tears spoke to relief rather than grief. "Names," Miss Marple observed gently, as if they had merely met at the grocer's. "You were discussing them at the Roses. It would be good to return to that." "Rosamond," Sarah said, laughing through her tears. Too obvious, perhaps. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied with characteristic wisdom. "Roses are old things. They remember. One could do worse than carry their memory forward." The financial audit that followed revealed the staggering scope of Mrs. Holloway's crimes, extending far beyond the postal theft that had prompted Mrs. Blackthorn's investigation. Forged money orders, redirected correspondence, and manipulated bank statements painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had enriched the postmistress while maintaining her facade of genteel poverty. Most disturbing was the discovery that several other elderly residents had been victims of similar schemes, their trust exploited through carefully orchestrated postal irregularities that had gone undetected for years. Professor Hartwell's meticulous documentation proved invaluable in establishing the complete timeline, his scholarly precision providing the foundation for understanding how such systematic betrayal could have flourished undetected. The sophistication of her approach was remarkable, he observed during one of his analytical discussions with Miss Marple. The concentrated laurel preparation required considerable botanical knowledge, while the timing exploited intimate understanding of human psychology. Inspector Craddock's final report resolved the remaining mysteries that had puzzled the investigation. The peculiar scent Sarah had noticed in the lemonade was traced to the laurel-infused wasp trap hung too near the refreshment table, where volatile compounds had risen with the sugary air in the afternoon heat. The overturned tumbler with its opalescent ring had recorded that contamination, an unlucky coincidence that had nearly led the investigation astray. The brown bottle clutched in Mrs. Blackthorn's hand, containing only water, had been placed there by the same calculating mind that had prepared the poisoned identification card. The missing glove had been removed when pain made coherent motion impossible, hastily hidden by someone who understood that evidence must be controlled even in the chaos following discovery. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, the village struggled to reconcile their memories of the efficient postmistress with the calculating predator who had systematically exploited their trust. The replacement postmaster, a competent young man from the neighboring village, found himself rebuilding not only disrupted postal services, but the psychological foundation of an institution that had been fundamentally compromised. The Rose Society, when it reconvened the following year, carried a different atmosphere entirely. Bramblewood Manor, now managed by Mrs. Blackthorn's distant relatives, hosted the event with efficient professionalism, but without the passionate dedication that had characterized Cordelia's stewardship. A memorial standard was planted by the potting shed, an old white musk with evening scent, bearing a small bronze label engraved with more restraint than sentiment. Miss Marple observed these changes from her cottage garden, where her own roses bloomed with particular abundance. The investigation had revealed not only the mechanics of murder, but the complex web of financial desperation, professional betrayal, and calculated deception that could flourish beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities. The village would heal, as villages do, but with the sobering knowledge that appearances, however carefully maintained, could conceal years of systematic exploitation beneath their civilized surfaces. On the evening the memorial was planted, Miss Marple lingered in the garden after others had gone, reflecting on the case while her knitting needles worked their familiar pattern. The truth, as always in her, considerable experience, had required patience and careful observation to emerge, but it had ultimately prevailed through the inexorable pressure of accumulated evidence and human nature's inevitable tendency to reveal itself under sufficient pressure. The rose competition that had provided cover for murder would be remembered not merely for its tragic conclusion, but as a permanent reminder that human nature, like the most carefully tended gardens, could nurture both beauty and corruption in equal measure, and that the most dangerous predators often wore the most respectable faces while conducting their systematic betrayal of trust and vulnerability. The weeks following Mrs. Holloway's arrest brought a peculiar quality to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were slowly exhaling after holding its breath through the worst of the crisis. The autumn air carried with it not only the scent of burning leaves and late roses, but the subtle change that comes when a community must rebuild trust from its very foundations. Dr. Webb's situation resolved itself with the quiet dignity that often accompanies genuine remorse. His plea of guilty to the embezzlement charges brought a suspended sentence and the requirement of full restitution, which he accepted with visible relief. The medical board's decision to strike him from practice seemed almost secondary to his own recognition that healing others required first healing oneself. When he approached Miss Marple one crisp October morning, His manner carried the careful humility of a man learning to live with the consequences of his choices. "I've accepted a position with a charitable clinic in the next county," he explained, his hands steadier than they had been in months. "Administrative work mostly, but honest work. Mrs. Blackthorn's estate has been generous about the repayment schedule, and I find myself grateful for the chance to make amends properly." Miss Marple's gentle nod acknowledged both his confession and his commitment to redemption. "Time has a way of clarifying our priorities, doesn't it, Doctor? I suspect you'll find your new position quite rewarding." The memorial service for Mrs. Blackthorn, held on a golden afternoon when the last roses bloomed with particular intensity, drew visitors from throughout the county. The church filled with the quiet dignity that marked such occasions, though Miss Marple noted how the congregation seemed to listen with unusual attention when Reverend Clement spoke of trust, vigilance, and the careful tending required by all communities. Inspector Craddock's final report provided the concrete details that allowed the village to understand the full scope of what had transpired. Mrs. Holloway's systematic postal theft had affected 8 elderly residents over a period of nearly 4 years, with total losses exceeding £15,000. Her guilty plea spared the community the ordeal of a lengthy trial, though her 15-year sentence served as a stark reminder that betrayal of public trust carried consequences as severe as the crimes themselves. The sophistication of her methods was remarkable, Craddock explained to Miss Marple during one of their final discussions of the case. Steam treatment to open correspondence, forged authorizations, redirected mail. She had essentially created a parallel postal service for her own enrichment. Mrs. Blackthorn's discovery threatened to expose not just theft, but a criminal enterprise that had been operating under everyone's noses. The Ashford cottage had become a place of genuine joy by November, when their daughter arrived with the perfect timing of those blessed with good fortune after adversity. They named her Cordelia Rose, a choice that pleased the village enormously and seemed to complete the circle of healing that had begun with Mrs. Blackthorn's death. Timothy's roses, now properly documented and honestly cultivated, showed promise of winning legitimate recognition in the coming year's competitions. Young Mr. Fairfax, the new postmaster, approached his duties with the careful efficiency of someone aware that trust, once broken, required patient rebuilding. His morning rounds included not just mail delivery, but the small courtesies that gradually restored confidence in the institution his predecessor had so thoroughly compromised. The elderly residents who had been Mrs. Holloway's victims found their faith in postal services slowly returning, though Miss Marple noticed they now examined their correspondence with the careful attention of those who had learned to verify what they had once simply trusted. Bramblewood Manor's new residents, Mrs. Blackthorn's distant cousins from London, brought a different energy to the estate. Their approach to the Rose Society competition, when it resumed the following spring, emphasized participation over rivalry, community over conquest. The memorial rose by the potting shed flourished under their care, its white blooms releasing evening fragrance that seemed to bless, rather than haunt, the garden where tragedy had unfolded. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often found herself reflecting on the case while her knitting needles maintained their familiar rhythm. The investigation had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder, but the complex psychology of long-term deception that could flourish within the most trusted institutions of village life. Mrs. Holloway's crime had been particularly insidious because it had exploited not just financial vulnerability, but the fundamental human need to trust those who manage the small, essential services that bind communities together. Yet the resolution had also demonstrated the village's essential resilience. The truth, however painful, had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed the bonds between neighbors. People were more careful now, more observant but not cynical. They had learned to look beyond appearances without losing their capacity for trust, to question the obvious without abandoning their faith in human goodness. On the last evening of November, as the first frost silvered her garden, Miss Marple completed the pale yellow cardigan she had been knitting since that fateful afternoon at the Rose Society competition. The pattern had worked out perfectly, each stitch building upon the last to create something both beautiful and practical. Much like the patient work of detection itself, she reflected. The village would continue its ancient rhythms, marked by changing seasons and the gradual accumulation of shared experience that transforms individual tragedies into collective wisdom. There would be other mysteries, other disruptions of the peace that seemed so permanent but was actually quite fragile. Yet Miss Marple felt confident that St. Mary Mead had learned something valuable from Mrs. Blackthorn's death, that the most dangerous secrets often hid behind the most respectable facades, and that the price of community safety was not suspicion, but careful, caring observation of the human nature that revealed itself in countless small details to those with patience to truly see. As she folded her completed knitting and prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that the rose competition which had provided cover for murder would be remembered not merely for its tragic conclusion, but as a permanent reminder that even the most beautiful gardens required constant vigilance against corruption, whether in soil or in the human heart. The truth, as always in her considerable experience, had ultimately prevailed through the inexorable pressure of accumulated evidence and the enduring power of a community's commitment to justice, however gently administered. Human nature, she had learned long ago, was indeed very dependable, in its capacity for both extraordinary kindness and calculated evil, and in its ultimate tendency to reveal itself to those who watched with sufficient care and understanding. The spring that followed brought with it the kind of renewal that seemed to wash away even the deepest stains on a community's memory. Miss Marple, observing the preparations for the new Rose Society competition from her cottage garden, reflected on how thoroughly St. Mary Mead had absorbed the lessons of the previous year's tragedy. The competition itself, held once again at Bramblewood Manor, carried an atmosphere of genuine celebration rather than desperate rivalry. Timothy Ashford's hybrid climbing roses, now properly documented and honestly cultivated, claimed second place with a grace that spoke to hard-won wisdom. Sarah, their infant daughter, Cordelia, Rose, sleeping peacefully in a wicker basket beside the display, radiated the contentment of those who had survived their darkest hour. Dr. Webb's absence was noted but not mourned. His letters from the charitable clinic spoke of meaningful work and gradual redemption, the kind of slow healing that could only come through honest acknowledgement of past failures. Young Mr. Fairfax had restored faith in the postal service through quiet competence, his careful attention gradually rebuilding trust in an institution that had been so thoroughly compromised. Inspector Craddock found Miss Marple by the memorial rose that afternoon, its white blooms releasing their evening fragrance near the potting shed where tragedy had unfolded. "It was never the grand things," he observed, settling beside her on the garden bench. "Not the financial ledgers or even Webb's confession. It was the small matters, the glove, the cloudy residue, a pearl-headed pin. People reveal themselves in very small ways," Miss Marple replied gently, her knitting needles maintaining their familiar rhythm. Mrs. Holloway had cultivated deception the way some cultivate roses. But deception, like certain treatments, always leaves traces for those who know how to look. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution. The truth had indeed set them free, though the price had been the painful recognition that evil could wear the most trusted faces. Yet St. Mary Mead had emerged stronger, its residents more observant but not cynical, wiser but not suspicious. Walking home through familiar lanes, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of justice properly served. The village would continue its ancient rhythms, watched over by neighbors who had learned to observe with both kindness and wisdom. The roses would bloom again, as they always did, beautiful and thorned in equal measure, tended by hands that understood both blessing and danger could flourish in the most familiar places. Human nature, she reflected with characteristic understatement, remained very much what it had always been, capable of extraordinary evil and equally extraordinary redemption, requiring only the patient attention of those willing to look beyond appearances to the truth that lay beneath. The memorial rose would continue to bloom each spring, a gentle reminder that even from the darkest soil, beauty could still emerge.